The bag of blood is warm against my palm, plastic slick with condensation, swaying like a heartbeat we can borrow. The monitor above him hiccups BVCS. A thin pulse then snaps into a single merciless line. He locks eyes with me, lips split, and rasps, "Not from them. Let me die." The alarm howls, and my oath tastes like metal. 3 hours earlier, I didn't know his hate would reach my hands. At 11:47 p.m., the ed smelled like bleach and old fries. The kind of odor that clings to your scrubs long after you've showered. The charge, nurse's station hummed with printers, and the relentless click of a blood pressure cuff cycling somewhere behind a curtain. My stethoscope tugged at my neck when I leaned over the track board to psych holds. One septic grandma, a toddler wheezing, and a note that made my stomach tighten, "Blood bank critically low." Outside, freezing rain stippled the ambulance bay doors, and the courier from the regional center had been canceled twice. We'd been stretching units all weekend, praying no one decided to bleed out in our zip code. In the corner of the trauma hall sat a red cooler with yesterday's Community Drive Stick a New Hope Baptist taped crook to the lid. It wasn't supposed to matter, and medically it didn't. But I'd learned that people bring their stories into everything we hang. When the radio crackled, it sounded like static wrapped around panic. Male, 30s, stabbed in the abdomen, the medic said, breathless, hypotensive, awake, refusing to lie back. We're 2 minutes out. Nicole, my procedure nurse, snapped open a drawer with the decisive anger of someone tired of being surprised. And Maya, our respiratory therapist, rolled the airway cart into place without looking at me. I pulled on gloves and felt the latex bite my knuckles as if the night wanted proof I was still human. They burst through the automatic doors trailing cold air and the smell of wet asphalt. On the stretcher was a man with a shaved head and a beard gone patchy with sweat. His hands clamped hard over a towel that was already turning the wrong shade of red. His forearm was inked with symbols I wished I didn't recognize, and a small, cheap cross bounced on a chain at his throat with every jolt. "Name's Caleb Rourke," the medic shouted. "Pressure 60 palp, heart rate 140, GCS 15, but he's fading. We slid him onto our bed." And the monitor answered with a shrill tachycardia that felt like a siren inside my skull. Nicole sank to large-bore IVS into his arms and, when the veins collapsed, drilled an IO into his tibia, the crunch making him swear. I pressed the ultrasound probe to his abdomen for a fast exam, the quick scan for internal bleeding, and the screen bloomed with black fluid. "Activate MTP," I said, already tasting the word shortage. Caleb's eyes found my face as I leaned in, and I saw the flicker recognition, calculation, the reflex of a man who decides what you are before you speak. "Don't touch me," he hissed, then bit down on a groan. I kept my voice even. "I'm Dr. Hill. You're bleeding inside your abdomen. I need to stop it, and we need blood to keep your organs alive until surgery." His jaw worked, and the towel under his hands darkened. The phone at my elbow rang, and the blood bank tech sounded like she'd been running for her life. "Hill, we can release to O negative right now," she said. "But that's it until the morning truck. And the rest are type-specific from the New Hope Drive." Behind me, I heard a resident whisper, "That's the Black Church on Maple." It was meant as logistics, not commentary, but words don't stay neutral once they heeing the air. Caleb's head turned toward the sound, and his eyes sharpened as if he'd been given a weapon. "No," he said, dry and final, and I thought he meant surgery, the fear, the helplessness. Then his eyes slid past me to the resident, to the cooler, and his voice steadied as his body weakened. "Not theirs. I'm not taking it." In my head I ran the checklist: capacity, consequences, alternatives, documentation. A competent adult can refuse, even if it kills them, and the law doesn't ask whether the reason is holy or hateful. It only asks whether the choice is clear. I leaned close enough to be heard over the beeps and suction, close enough that he could see I wasn't stepping back. "Caleb, we match blood by type and antibodies," I said. "Not by the person who donated it." He tried to laugh and it broke into a wet cough. "Not from them," he rasped, eyes burning with the certainty of a drowning man choosing the water. The nurse, at his side, tightened the tape on his jaw clenched. If his pressure slid any lower, we'd have to intubate, thread a tube into his windpipe and breathe for him. In the hallway, the cooler from blood bank arrived with 2 units and a stack of paperwork that looked absurdly clean for something that mattered this much. Nicole spiked the first bag, and the dark column of packed cells slid down the tubing toward the catheter like an answer we didn't deserve. Caleb saw the label on the release slip. New hope, and his hand shot up, surprisingly strong, catching the line before it reached him. "Stop," he said, and the monitor's tone stumbled, a warning turning into prophecy. I held the blood in my fist, feeling its weight, and watched his hate wrestle his need. The tubing jerked in my fist when Caleb grabbed for it again, fingers slippery with sweat, knuckles whitening as if he could squeeze his own blood back into his body by force. The monitor answered with a frantic stutter, his heart trying to outrun the fact that his pressure was vanishing. Nicole's eyes met mine over the 4-pole, asking without asking whether we were really going to let him do this. I kept the bag suspended, half a foot from his arm, and felt the room tilt toward an outcome none of us wanted. His words came out like broken glass, loud enough to slice everyone within earshot. He spat slurs at the resident, then at Maya, then at me, as if naming us wrong would make us stop being necessary. The trauma bay, usually a place of shared urgency, tightened into something colder, an orchestra that kept playing while one instrument screamed. The clerk outside drew the curtain halfway, an instinctive gesture of privacy. But hate has a way of leaking through fabric. I watched Nicole's jaw flex, watched her swallow whatever she wanted to say. "Caleb," I said, low and close. Because the loud voice in an emergency room is rarely the one that wins. You're in hemorrhagic shock. Your organs are starving. Surgery can't fix what it can't reach in time. He stared at me with pupils too wide. The look of a man holding on to control because everything else was sliding away. "I know what you are," he whispered, like it was a diagnosis. The towel under his hands pulsed darker, and when he inhaled, it sounded like he was breathing through a straw. The surgeon on call, Dr. Whitaker, arrived with wet hair and a coat she hadn't bothered to button, the smell of rain following her in like a witness. She took one look at the fast image still frozen on the screen, at the black pooling where there should have been gray, and her expression settled into grim math. "He's got a belly full of blood," she said, already pulling on gloves. "He needs an X-lap. Now open him. Find the hole. Clamp. Pack. Pray." Then her eyes flicked to the untouched transfusion line and she understood the part no ultrasound shows. Nicole tried again, careful, professional, voice thin with strain. "Sir, we're trying to help you. Please let us start the blood while we move you upstairs." Caleb's laugh came out wet and wrong. "I'd rather die," he said, and for a second the sentence hung there as an actual plan, not a dramatic threat. My mind ran the checklist the way it always does when the heart is racing: capacity, comprehension, voluntariness, consistency. He was awake, oriented, articulate, hateful, and terrifyingly clear. Then his clarity began to fray at the edges, the way a picture does when the signal starts to fail. His eyes lost focus for a beat, his chin sagged, and the monitor's pitch changed as his pulse tried to become a rumor. Maya stepped closer, hands hovering near his face, watching the way his tongue softened in his mouth. Intubation, placing a tube through the mouth into the trachea to secure the airway, loomed as the next cliff we might have to jump from. But sedating him to do it would also steal his voice, and the law doesn't care whether silence comes from medicine or from convenience. A woman's voice rose outside the bay, sharp with panic and exhaustion. "That's him, Caleb. Caleb, look at me." Security tried to slow her, but she slipped through on pure fear, hair in a messy knot. A toddler's blanket clutched to her chest like it could stop bleeding. She saw the tattoos, the blood, the faces surrounding him, and her eyes darted to me as if I was the only fixed point. He said he was going to meet his friends. She blurted. He said it was just talk, please. You have to save him. Caleb turned his head toward her and the mask slipped for half a second. Not kindness, just something like shame. He used that second to weaponize her presence. Tell them, he rasped, nodding toward me with a flick of contempt. Tell them I said no. She froze, confusion collapsing into horror as she realized what no meant in this room. No what? She asked, voice breaking on the last word. Nicole glanced at the cooler and then away, as if the sticker could burn her eyes. I could feel the entire staff holding a collective breath, not because we didn't know what to do clinically, but because the human part had turned the algorithm into a trap. Caleb's hand found his wife's wrist, a weak grip that still carried authority. Promise, he said, and the word sounded like he was asking her to sign something in blood. She shook her head, tears sliding down fast. And I watched her fight two instincts at once, to respect the man she loved, and to keep him alive long enough to apologize for whatever he'd been becoming. Caleb, stop, she pleaded. We have a son. He blinked slowly, eyelids heavy. And I saw, the moment his body started to choose for him, the monitor screamed as his rhythm flipped ugly, his pulse thready and then absent for a terrifying blink. No pulse, the resident called, voice cracking, hands already going to his sternum. Compressions began hard, rhythmic, the bed rocking with each push while Whitaker swore under her breath and demanded the OR be readied anyway. Because surgeons are trained to bet against death even when the odds are obscene. I hovered at the head of the bed, watching his mouth slacken, watching his wife recoil as if the sound of ribs giving under pressure had slapped her. The blood bag still hung there, a silent solution no longer allowed to be simple. Stop compressions. I ordered for the briefest pause, my fingers searching his neck again, praying for anything. A pulse fluttered back, weak and spiteful, as if his heart resented being asked to continue. We have something, I said, and the room surged forward again, but the question didn't go away, it sharpened. If he lost consciousness fully, would we honor the refusal he made while awake, even as his body begged for what his ideology rejected? I looked at Whitaker, at Nicole, at the tubing trembling in my hand, and understood that the next minutes wouldn't just decide whether Caleb lived. They would decide what kind of doctors we were willing to be. When the pulse came back, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a debt the room had just taken out in his name. Compression stopped, the bed stopped rocking, and for the first time in minutes, I could hear the smaller sounds again, the suction whining, rain ticking the glass, the four-pump complaining like a bored metronome. Caleb's eyes fluttered open with a kind of exhausted defiance, and his wife made a sound that wasn't a word. Just relief, trying and failing to become prayer. I've signed death certificates for people who never got a choice, and I've watched families beg us to do everything when everything was only a slower way to lose. Autonomy is supposed to be clean in a textbook. A competent adult gets to refuse, even if it's irrational, even if it's tragic. But here, autonomy had a face, and it had a mouth full of blood and hate. And it was looking at me like my hands were contaminated by my existence. The oath in my chest didn't argue with the law. It argued with my humanity. I leaned close so he could hear me without turning the bay into a courtroom. Caleb, I need to ask you plainly, I said, and I hated how steady my voice sounded, as if steadiness could make this less violent. You understand you are likely to die without blood, correct? His gaze snapped sharp again, and the reflex of cruelty returned like muscle memory. I'd rather die, he whispered, then louder as if volume made it sacred, than take anything from them. I forced the next part through my teeth. Repeat it for me. You're refusing transfusion, even if it kills you. He nodded once. Slow, deliberate. Nicole was already pulling the refusal form from the trauma clipboard, the hospital's thin paper attempt to hold back chaos. She set a pen in his hand, and for a moment his fingers couldn't close around it because his body was losing the fight faster than his ideology. His wife stared at the pen like it was a weapon. "Caleb, please," she said, voice trembling. "This isn't religion. This is spite." He dragged his eyes to her and softened only enough to be more dangerous. "Promise me," he said, and she shook her head harder, tears falling onto the blanket she'd brought as if she'd known, somehow, that tonight would need something to hold. Whitaker stepped in, the surgeon's urgency cutting through the emotional fog like a scalpel. "Hill, I can open his abdomen and clamp what I find," she said. "But if I don't have blood running while I'm in there, I'm operating on an empty tank." She wasn't threatening, she was stating physics. She glanced at Caleb, then at his wife, then back at me with a look that said she'd fought this battle before and hated who it turned her into. "You want to honor him," she added, quieter, "or you want him alive to regret it later?" I called the blood bank again, pressing the phone so hard to my ear it hurt. The tech's voice was strained, the sound of a system stretched thin. "We've got one more O negative," she said, "but it's reserved for OB unless you override. Everything else we can issue fast tonight is from that drive." I looked at the cooler like it was a locked door with a key I wasn't allowed to use. The irony sat in my stomach like cold coffee. A community had shown up to donate life, and the man bleeding out in front of me was turning it into a moral battleground. Caleb's breathing began to hitch, shallow and fast, and his words started to smear at the edges. Maya met my eyes and gave the smallest nod toward the airway cart, because she could see what I was trying not to see. He was tiring, and soon his body would choose silence. Intubation, placing a tube through the mouth into the trachea to secure the airway and allow ventilation, would buy time for transport and surgery, but it would also take his voice away. If I sedated him now, did I protect him, or did I conveniently remove the refusal that made this messy? I asked for the charge nurse to pull in a second physician as a witness, not because I needed moral support, but because I needed accountability. We didn't have time for an ethics consult, not real time, not the slow kind of deliberation that belongs to daylight. Still, I wanted someone else to hear what he was saying while he could still say it. Someone else to confirm that this wasn't confusion or delirium dressed up as conviction. The other attending arrived, took one look at the tattooed forearm and the plummeting pressure, and then listened without flinching as Caleb repeated his refusal again. Outside the bay, the hallway noise shifted, a subtle change that made every nurse's shoulders tighten. Security radioed in that two men with matching insignias were demanding to see Caleb, angry and loud, and that a police unit was en route because the argument was turning into something uglier. The hospital, that fragile promise of neutrality, was becoming a stage for the same hatred that had already taken root in his veins. I looked at his wife and saw her realize, for the first time, that even if we saved him, whatever he was tied to would keep pulling. I went back to his bedside and made my voice small, not gentle, precise. "Caleb, I'm giving you one last clear choice while you can still make it," I said. "If you refuse transfusion, we will document it and we will honor it, even if it means you die on this table or in the OR." His eyes burned with triumph for a heartbeat, the cruel satisfaction of forcing the world to bend. Then his lids drooped, his head rolled slightly, and the monitor's pitch climbed as his pressure slipped again. Nicole set the pen into his weakening fingers, and Whitaker's gloved hands hovered, ready to cut, while I stared at that blood bag and felt the room closing around a single question: do I save the body he lives in? Or do I protect the right he's using to hate me? The moment Caleb's chin sagged toward his collarbone, the room changed its posture. The way a crowd shifts when someone on stage forgets a line. His eyes rolled back, the whites flashing under the harsh lights. and the monitor's song thinned into a frantic, high-pitched pleading. Maya's hand was already at his jaw, lifting, feeling the slack that meant his airway was no longer his to protect. I heard myself say his name, not as a doctor, but as a person trying to tether another person to consciousness long enough to matter. "Caleb," I said again, louder, and his eyelids didn't answer. His wife reached for him, fingertips hovering over his cheek like she was afraid to leave fingerprints on the last moment she'd ever have. "He can't hear you," Nicole murmured, not unkindly, and that single sentence felt like a door closing. In the space of a breath, the man who'd weaponized his refusal was sliding into the kind of silence where our training kicks in and the law becomes foggy around the edges. "Airway," Maya said, voice clipped, and I nodded once. Because nodding is how you admit you're about to take something from someone. The resident pushed accommodate and paralytic, the medicine turning his muscles to stillness so we could put a tube where it needed to be. Intubation is a procedure that looks brutal because it is metal, light, a mouth forced open. A tube passed into the trachea, yet it's also a promise that breathing doesn't have to be voluntary to be real. The laryngoscope blade lifted his tongue. The cords appeared pale and wet. The tube slid through like a decision already made. "Tubes in," Maya said, and the ventilator took over with a mechanical sigh. His chest rose and fell under someone else's rhythm. And the monitor kept screaming anyway because oxygen isn't the problem when your circulatory system is bleeding into an empty space. Whitaker's gloved hands hovered over his abdomen, already marked with the rough lines of where she would cut. And her eyes met mine with that surgeon's version of prayer. Give me blood or give me an excuse to stop. Pressure's 40 systolic, the resident called, voice thin. "We're losing him." Nicole held the blood bag up. The tubing primed, the clamp ready. And in that suspended second, I felt the entire night condense into one clear image. Dark, red fluid that could keep his heart pumping, and my hand being the gatekeeper between a living body and a dying ideology. His wife made a sound like she was being strangled by her own grief. "Please," she begged, turning to me as if I were a judge instead of a tired man in a stained gown. He didn't hear me. "Docent, they know what he's saying." She looked down at Caleb's face, now expressionless under tape and plastic, and her voice sharpened in panic. "He can't even speak." That can't count anymore, can it? It was the oldest trick tragedy plays in hospitals. It makes you responsible for two truths at once. Caleb had refused while awake, clearly, repeatedly, in front of witnesses. And now Caleb was silent, chemically paralyzed, while his body kept trying to die. Autonomy doesn't vanish when someone loses their voice. If it did, every sedative would become a loophole and every ventilator a weapon. But the part of me that still believed medicine was cleaner than the world wanted to argue that unconsciousness changes the rules. That implied consent is a bridge we're allowed to cross when the river is death. Do you have an advance directive? "Anything written?" I asked his wife, because sometimes paper can bear what people can't. She shook her head violently, hair sticking to her wet cheeks. "No, God, no." He thought he was invincible. Her hands balled into fists. He's not. He's not a monster. He got pulled into something. Then she looked at me, at my skin, and flinched as if the implication of what she was asking finally landed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the apology breaking apart before it could become whole. Outside the bay, security radioed again. His friends were closer now. Louder, the kind of men who treat Anna like a battleground because they've never been forced to watch their beliefs bleed out. The charge nurse motioned toward the door, eyes wide, silently asking whether we needed to lock down. I felt a strange, bitter clarity. This wasn't only about Caleb's body. It was about what he represented walking back out into the world if we saved him, and what it meant if we didn't. Whitaker leaned in, voice low, urgent, almost tender in its brutality, "Hill, I can crack him open right now," she said. "But without blood, he will arrest on the table. I will be holding his aorta in my hand and watching him die." Her gaze flicked to the bag. "Start it, or call it. Don't make me pretend there's a third option." Nicole's fingers tightened around the clamp. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at me. Nurses see through our masks. They know when we're about to turn a moral wound into a policy wound. "Doctor," she said carefully, like she was stepping onto ice. "He refused while awake. We documented it. If we hang that blood now, we cross a line we can't uncross." My throat went dry, the antiseptic smell suddenly sharp enough to sting. I looked at Caleb's face, staped, silent, ventilated, the hate temporarily erased by pharmacology. I wondered, with a quiet fury, whether this was the only way the world ever let men like him stop speaking. Then I looked at the blood label, the barcode, the sterile language that reduces a donor's humanity to compatibility. In medicine, blood is blood. In life, blood is history. "Stop," I heard myself say, and Nicole froze. The words didn't feel righteous. It felt like a decision made with shaking hands. I stepped closer to the bed so everyone could hear me without my voice turning into theater. "We honor the refusal," I said. "No transfusion," the sentence landed heavy, not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. His wife's knees buckled and the charge nurse caught her before she hit the floor. Her wail filled the bay, raw and animal, and it made my skin crawl with the instinct to fix something, anything immediately. "You're letting him die," she screamed, and I didn't correct her because in a way she was right. Whitaker's eyes hardened, not at me, but at reality. "Then I'm not taking him to the OR to do violence for nothing," she said, and her scalpel hand lowered. Caleb's monitor, as if offended by the delay in its verdict, suddenly dipped into a rhythm that looked like chaos wearing a mask. The alarm changed its tone, higher, sharper, VFib. The resident shouted. The defibrillator paddle slapped gel on his chest. The smell of it sweet and chemical, and I watched Maya's hands keep the tube secure as if holding the airway could hold the soul. Clear. The shock snapped through him, lifting his body like a puppet jerked by an impatient god. For a heartbeat, the monitor flirted with a rhythm, then fell away again. "No pulse," Nicole said, voice steady in the way only practiced grief can be. Compressions resumed, resulting scamblanche gloves her. The bag of blood still hung there, full, dark, unused life in a container that had become contraband in the face of one man's hate. "Time?" I asked, because doctors ask time when they can't ask forgiveness. 2 minutes of CPR, the resident answered. I watched Caleb's wife sob against the wall, watched her stare at me as if she could burn my oath into my skin by force. I watched Whitaker step back, the surgeon's body language saying there was nothing left to cut that would matter. Achiminucci for the room was sweating, the compressions relentless, the ventilator indifferent. Achiminucci sixth, the kind that makes you keep going because it resembles hope. At minute 8, my arms felt heavy even though I wasn't the one pushing, because witnessing is its own form of labor. I leaned in, listened, looked, and felt something in me go quiet. "Stop," I said softly, and the hands on his chest lifted away. The sudden stillness was obscene. The monitor flattened and kept its thin tone for a moment, like a scream held too long, and then even it seemed to tire. I stared at Caleb rock alive an hour ago in the worst way. Dead now, in the most ordinary way, and the blood bag swung gently on the pole. Untouched, as if mocking the idea that salvation is ever purely medical. The room stayed frozen for a beat after I called it, as if everyone was waiting for the monitor to argue with me. The flat line held steady, a thin, unwavering accusation, and then the charge nurse reached up and silenced the alarm. The sudden quiet felt louder than the code had, like someone had shut a door on a storm while leaving the wreckage inside. I watched the compression marks bloom under Caleb's sternum, the imprint of our effort stamped into skin that no longer needed anything. Nicole's hands moved first, not from impatience but from ritual, the way you tidy a table after a meal nobody wanted. She unclipped the defib pads carefully, folding the sticky tabs back onto themselves so they wouldn't catch on anything. And she lowered the blood bag from its hook with the same care you'd use to hold a sleeping infant. When she capped the tubing and set it in a biohazard bin, her fingers hesitated. A microsecond of disbelief, like her muscles couldn't understand why we had carried life into the room just to throw it away. She didn't look at me, but I could feel the question in the angle of her shoulders. Maya loosened the tape securing the tube and listened to the ventilator for a second longer than necessary. Because for her, the airway is always personal. Intubation had been the cleanest thing we did tonight, straightforward. Technical, an action with a known purpose, and it had changed nothing that mattered. She switched off the machine and removed the tube in one smooth motion, the kind you learn after you've taken too many breaths away from too many people. The smell that rose from his mouth wasn't hatred anymore, just the metallic, sour scent of blood and stomach acid. Human in the most ordinary way. Whitaker peeled her gloves off with a snap and stepped back, already leaving the case in her mind, because surgeons have to, or they drown. "Document everything," she said, voice flat, eyes not quite meeting mine. He refused. "You had witnesses." "It's clean." Clean. The word landed wrong because nothing about this felt clean. The trauma. Attending walked out without another sentence, coat damp. And I watched her disappear into the hallway where other patients waited with problems that didn't carry ideologies. Caleb's wife was on the floor, held up by the charged nurse's arm around her shoulders. Her face pressed into fabric that smelled like disinfectant and strangers. Her sobs came in waves, deep enough that they shook her whole body. And each time she inhaled it sounded like she was fighting to pull air back through a world that had decided to punish her by association. I knelt a few feet away, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her, and I kept my gloved hands in my lap like a penitent. The space between us was filled with things she couldn't forgive and things I couldn't explain. "I didn't know," she whispered suddenly, lifting her head, mascara smeared like bruises under her eyes. "I didn't know he'd go that far. The sentence wasn't a defense. It was a confession, heavy with the shame of loving someone who had made themselves unlovable." She looked over at Caleb's body, at the stillness, at the sheet we'd pulled up to his chest, and her voice turned sharp with grief. "He made you do it," she said, and I didn't correct her because she was right about that too. He had turned our duty into his last act of control. I told her the truth in the only form that wouldn't be another kind of violence. He refused while he was awake. I said quietly. He understood what it meant. We confirmed it. We documented it. The words tasted like paperwork and ash, and the more accurately I spoke, the less comfort they offered. She flinched, then nodded slowly as if her brain was trying to keep up with her heart. "So it's legal," she said, and the last word came out like a curse. A commotion thudded in the whole security voices, heavy footsteps, a shouted name, Caleb's friends. I heard one of them demand answers, heard another swear that we'd let him die on purpose. And I felt the old, familiar tightening under my ribs that comes when it turns into a courtroom with no judge. The charge nurse signaled for security to keep them out of the bay, and for the first time that night I was grateful for a locked door. Hospitals are built on trust, and tonight trust felt like something you could break with your hands. I stepped out to speak to them because it was safer if their anger hit me instead of the nurses. 3 men stood in the corridor, faces flushed, insignias half hidden under jackets, and their eyes took me in the way Caleb's had fast, sorting, deciding. One leaned forward. "What did you do?" he demanded, and his breath smelled like tobacco and adrenaline. I kept my voice level, the same tone I use with families, with drunks, with anyone whose grief wants a target. "We ran a full resuscitation," I said. "He died. The words weren't a negotiation. "Did you give him blood?" Another asked, and something in his gaze flicked toward the cooler sticker that still sat on a cart, crooked and innocent. I felt my spine stiffen. "He refused transfusion," I answered, and watched their faces shift as the refusal became a story they could twist. Their anger didn't have the dignity of sorrow. It had the hunger of ideology searching for a new mouthpiece. Security stepped closer, hands near radios, and I could sense how quickly this could turn into a headline. Back inside, Nicole was already writing the note, her pen moving like an EKG steady strokes that make chaos look orderly. She paused when I returned. "You okay?" she asked, which was really her way of asking whether we were still the kind of team that could stand to look at each other after this. I nodded, because the alternative would have been too intimate. My gloves were still on, speckled with dried blood. And I realized with a jolt that I hadn't washed my hands yet because I'd been afraid of what it would mean to rinse him off me. When I finally went to the sink, the water came out scalding, and the soap smelled sharply of citrus meant to suggest cleanliness. I scrubbed it until the skin on my knuckles stung, watching red-tinted foam spiral down the drain. In the mirror above the sink, my face looked older than it had at the start of the shift, the kind of age you earn in minutes. Behind me, the ED continued its relentless rhythm monitors beeping. Stretchers, rolling. Someone laughing too loudly at a joke they didn't feel because the world doesn't pause for anyone's moral injury. Before I left the bay for good, I went back to Caleb's wife. She'd been moved to a quieter room, a blanket around her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of water she wasn't drinking. She looked up at me like she wanted to hate me and couldn't find the energy. "Was it?" she started, then swallowed. "Was it because he said those things?" The question landed with all the terror of living in a country where people like him still get saved, still get protected by systems they despise. "No," I said, and I made my voice a promise I wasn't sure I deserved to make. It wasn't about what he said to me. It was about what he chose for himself. She stared at the floor for a long time, and when she finally nodded, it was small, almost imperceptible, the motion of someone who doesn't accept the truth but can't fight it anymore. I stood, and for a second I wanted to tell her something gentle, something that would turn this into a lesson with a neat edge, but the ER doesn't give you neat edges. It gives you scars. By 4:38 a.m., the night had thinned into that peculiar gray that isn't quite morning, isn't quite mercy. The ED lights were still fluorescent and unforgiving, but the hallway noise softened, as if the building itself had run out of rage. I walked past Trauma 1 and saw the empty bed made up again, fresh sheet. Fresh chucks. The room reset like nothing had happened because hospitals survive by pretending every tragedy is replaceable. The smell of antiseptic lingered, sharp and clean. But it couldn't cover the faint metallic trace that lives in the corners after a death. I tried to return to work. I really did, but every chart I opened felt like a different language. A nurse called my name twice before I realized she was speaking to me. And when I looked up, I saw pity in her eyes before she replaced it with professionalism. That's what we do here. We lock our feelings in a drawer, label it later, and keep moving. Only later doesn't arrive on schedule. It waits for you in the quiet, the way blood waits for gravity. I kept thinking about the blood bag, how it had swung there on the pole, full and ready, while a man chose death as a final statement. Blood, to us, is compatibility in hemoglobin and oxygen delivery. We talk about units and cross-matches and antibodies, and that language is how we protect ourselves from what blood actually is: someone else's time, someone else's generosity, someone else's body saying, without words, you can have some of me, it keeps you here. The donor doesn't get to choose, the recipient, and maybe that's the only purity left in the system. I've been called slurs before by patients in pain, by drunks, by people whose fear comes out as venom. And I learned early to treat it like smoke, unpleasant, dangerous, but not the fire itself. Caleb's hate was different because it wasn't an accidental discharge. It was intentional, coherent, structured, like a belief system wearing a pulse. And the part that lodged under my skin wasn't that he hated me. It was that, in the end, I had to respect him anyway. People imagine autonomy as a noble principle. Freedom with a halo, but autonomy is just power. And power doesn't always come dressed in wisdom. That night forced me to remember something medicine tries to forget. The right to refuse care is not a reward for being good. It's a boundary we honor, because if we only respected choices we agreed with, we'd be practicing control, not care. In the mirror at the sink, with my hands scrubbed raw, I looked like a man trying to wash off an idea. Later, when the charge nurse handed me the paperwork, my signature felt heavier than it should have. I wrote my name and realized I'd been signing variations of the same sentence for years. I witnessed suffering, and I did what I could within the rules. Only this time the rules weren't a comfort. They were the knife. Nicole kept her head down while she filed it, but when she passed me in the hallway, she brushed my elbow with the back of her glove, barely a touch, like she was reminding me I wasn't alone in the room when it happened. The hardest part was the wife. Not because she defended him, she didn't, but because she was collateral damage to his ideology. She came in carrying a blanket like a charm, and left with a death certificate shaped like a question she would ask herself for years. How do you love someone who turns their last breath into harm? When she asked me if it was because of what he said, I told her no, but I also knew the real answer was more complicated. It wasn't because of what he said. It was because what he said was what he believed, and what he believed was what he chose. Near shift change, I stepped outside into the ambulance bay for 30 seconds of air that didn't smell like bleach. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt shining under the sodium lights, and my breath came out in pale clouds. I thought about my father teaching me to keep my shoulders back, to never look like the world had a right to push me down. And I felt that lesson collide with another one I learned in residency. Sometimes the world pushes anyway, and your job is not to become it. When I went back inside, the Ed was already rearranging itself around the next emergency, the next family, the next set of hands reaching for help. I paused by the blood bank cooler before it was wheeled away, and I imagined the donors, ordinary people with warm arms and inconvenient schedules, sitting in folding chairs, squeezing stress balls, trusting that their small act of decency would land somewhere it mattered. Caleb never received it, but it wasn't wasted. It proved something important in the ugliest possible way. The system had offered him life without asking him to deserve it, and his refusal didn't stain the offer, it exposed his emptiness. I carried that case home like a stone in my pocket, not because I doubted the medical steps, but because I hated how powerless my oath can feel in the face of a person's will. Do no harm sounds simple until you realize harm can be chosen, demanded, insisted upon, and you still have to stand there with steady hands. That night didn't teach me to be softer. It taught me to be precise about what compassion is. Compassion isn't saving someone at any cost, it's showing up with everything you have, even when the only thing you can offer is respect for a choice you would never make.